welcome to another episode of Zcash Explained. In this episode, we go over what fungibility is, transparent blockchains, and Bitcoin's fungibility problem. Fungibility is a property that we use to describe interchangeable goods, and the extent to which one unit can be exchanged at the same rate with any other unit of that good is how fungible it is. So as an example, we can have Alice here, and Alice has a note, and that note's value is $1. And we have Bob. Bob also has a note of the same value. And so Alice can hand over her note, and Bob can check that the note has a hologram on it and that it's authentic, and in exchange hand back Alice his note. And so this is perfectly normal. It's a fair exchange. And so would the same hold true in Bitcoin today? Again, we have Alice, and she has 1 BTC, and Bob also has 1 BTC. So would Bob necessarily be happy to accept Alice's Bitcoin and in exchange send back his? Well, this is a question, and there is potentially a huge problem in Bitcoin. So let's find out why. So to find out what the problem is, we need to first understand the UTXO model. And so this is the unspent transaction output model within the Bitcoin blockchain. So this describes how transactions are generated. So we have a user here, we have Alice, and we have her wallet. And this wallet, you could say, contains 10 BTC. So she generates a transaction and she wants to pay a merchant, let's say 7 BTC. So she generates a transaction, and the transaction has an input. And the input in her case is 10 BTC. So she's paying a merchant. The output here is 7 BTC. She receives her change of 3 BTC. And so we can see here that the input and output are balanced. So for the UTXO model, we say TX in equals TX out minus the fees that are taken by miners to include this transaction within a block. And using this information, all users on the network are able to validate that no value was created out of thin air within a transaction. So this is a way of ensuring that all the rules are being followed on the blockchain. So using the UTXO model, many cryptocurrencies, not just Bitcoin, are able to publicly validate that no value is being created out of thin air. And so all this data forms a transaction graph. Okay, our transaction graph. If we use our example of Alice paying a merchant, we'll call this TX0. In that transaction, there was an input of 10 BTC, and she paid the merchant 7. She received back change of 3. So here is the transaction to the merchant. Our merchant receives it and makes another transaction. We'll call this TX1. So as an input to this one, our merchant has the 7 BTC that Alice paid. Oh, sorry. That Alice paid our merchant, and we can say that our merchant pays out 5 and receives back change 2, which is later spent in another transaction. Okay, I won't go into too many details the change that Alice received from paying the merchant 3 Bitcoin is given to her friend Bob. So we have Bob here, and the input to this transaction here, 3 Bitcoin, which Bob immediately gives to his friend Charlie. Okay, so sorry, I'll probably name that TX2, and it goes on TX3, 4, and 5. So here we find that in the transaction graph on Bitcoin, the source and destination of funds is explicitly detailed, as well as the amounts being transferred. And this is the problem that Satoshi mentioned. He was trying to figure out a solution in which the validity of transactions still holds, so no values is being created out of nowhere. So TX in still needs to equal TX out minus fees. But he was hoping to find a way using zero knowledge proofs to hide the source and destination and perhaps even the amounts being transferred. Okay, so we've taken a look at fungibility and we've built an understanding of the transaction graph. So we're going to now actually get a better picture of where the problem is. So Bitcoin, of course, its genesis block, January 3rd, 2009. And over the years, there were several services and businesses and merchants and exchanges that actually began to use Bitcoin as a store of value. And so we have another business or service that began to use the network, and we can call these analysis firms. And they're actually quite useful. So what they did is this is the analysis firm, and what they have is a way to view the blockchain. And what they're actually doing is they're monitoring it in real time, and they're building a picture of all the transactions that are occurring on the chain. Okay, here we have the analysis firm, and this is the service they're performing. So if we go back to our original example, we had Alice who is paying a merchant 7 BTC. So this is our merchant. And we have Alice here. So Alice is making this payment to the merchant. And it's actually in the merchant's best interests to check with the analysis firm that the funds that they're receiving probably aren't stolen. So the merchant will check with this analysis firm and they will ask, hey, can you check the transaction history? Where did this BTC come from? Just so that we're in the clear. And the analysis firm will say, well, hey, this is Alice here, and this is the merchant. So they'll check this transaction, and then they'll see where was the source of funds? Where did Alice get her original 10 BTC from our example? And it may actually turn out that at some point in the transaction history, so we could go any number of steps, as you can see here, any number of steps in the past, and they'll be checking that the funds wouldn't have passed through a mixer, or they wouldn't have passed through a country that is deemed unacceptable, or there is no association with theft or anything like that. And if they do indeed find that at one point the funds that she received came from like South Sudan or something, then the analysis firm can say, well, we deem this actually high risk. So they'll go back to the merchant and they'll say, this transaction, you would actually need to refuse it. And actually, it's not a person that would be asking analysis firm an analysis firm over the phone. This is actually an automated process, and it's done in software that's provided by the analysis firms to several merchants and exchanges and businesses, and this is an entirely automated process. So because many merchants and exchanges are going to these third-party analysis services to check transactions, we find that an increasing proportion of network activity is actually going through a third party. So if we go to like bitcoin.com and we look at the advantages, why should someone buy Bitcoin, they'd probably find that the ideal properties of a crypto is that it's peer-to-peer, that it's permissionless, that it's decentralized, and censorship resistant, and of course fungible. So why are these important? Well, Bitcoin itself is a peer-to-peer network. You can submit a transaction to the network. So we have person 1 here submitting a transaction to the network, and it will then be received by person 2 provided that the pub address is correct. And this entire process is permissionless. So anyone can join the network and submit a transaction to any recipient of their choice. They can also join the network and validate consensus. They can become a miner, and they can join and leave the network at will, and they're not going through any central authority. It's also decentralized. Anyone in the world can participate in the network for these things. And so we come to censorship resistance and fungibility. So because in our example we had Alice paying a merchant and the merchant actually checking with an analysis firm. So we have our peer-to-peer transaction here, Alice paying the merchant 7 BTC. But then we have the analysis firm, which is actually a third party. So this now becomes a permission system. So we have our permissionless peer-to-peer exchange happening between Alice and the merchant. But the merchant now, for due diligence, and perhaps rightly so, is checking with a third party. So this is now a permissioned transaction on the network. And we see an increasing number of these permissioned transactions occurring. And the reason it's occurring is because each of the coins actually has a known history. So an analysis firm is now able to check the history, the full transaction history, and check if the funds either went through a country or a service that they deem to be too high risk. And so we can say that now permissionless isn't quite right, and it's not exactly censorship resistant, because again, you can have someone who's trying to make a transaction, but instead of the merchant checking with an analysis firm, you could say that a governing body could actually go and say that people are required to use these analysis firms, and that perhaps even miners should be required to use these services. So if someone wants to make a peer-to-peer exchange from 1 to 2, then actually when they submit it to the network is checking with our analysis firm to see if this can be accepted, and the analysis firm comes back and they say, hey, that's fine, and then the miners will include it in a block. So it's not really censorship resistant anymore, and it's not really a permissionless network. There's questions as to whether miners could even censor transactions which originate in countries that are again deemed unacceptable. So there's a question mark here. So I hope this has given you a good understanding of where exactly the problem is with a transparent blockchain. So given the information we've learned, we can see the growing problem of fungibility within transparent chains such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. There are already examples of premiums being paid for newly mined coins, and so this is the beginning of what you could view as a tiered system or tiers of coins. So you can have the newly mined coins, so these would have the highest value. These would be coins which don't have any history whatsoever, and these would probably be of interest to investment firms and other such entities. And you could probably have a tier of good coins. So these would be coins which don't have too long of a history, but they haven't gone through any. They've just been held really. And then you could have a low tier. So these would be coins which have a very long history. They've been exchanged a number of times and have probably gone through a mixing service or an organization which is deemed, it could be like a political organization even. And so these would be the low value coins. Going back to our original example with Bob and Alice, so we had Alice with 1 BTC, and she was hoping to get a fair exchange with Bob for his Bitcoin here. So given this example, Bob might be thinking, and given the information we've learned, Bob might now need to consider the transaction history. Where did this Bitcoin that Alice is giving me come from? Because perhaps if at some point in the future I wish to sell into fiat, would the exchange be willing to take that Bitcoin that I've been given? If I'm looking to pay a business with this BTC, would they be able to accept it given the automated systems that are in growing use? So this is the problem. We begin to see the Bitcoin network actually begin to lose its function due to the erosion of its fungibility by third parties which permission transactions or a growing number of transactions on the chain. So how can this be solved? And we're going to get into that in the next video with Zcash shielded transactions and the shielded pool.